this second discussion topic is global trends and realities. Do quotas and mandates build better boardrooms? So we've been talking a little bit about trends in industrialized countries, particularly in Europe, around actually legislating or codifying board diversity targets for public companies. So I want us to talk about, we'll have 4 questions where we'll be talking about the merits, right, of having quotas, and do having these quotas really risk or enhance quality of governance. We've talked about quality a little bit of the candidates, and the likely impact on the U.S. So I'm going to start with our first question. A little bit of backdrop. So there's the trend that we've talked about. However, even with this trend in Europe to legislate, the percentage of corporate board members that are diverse is at around 11%. So that's still low. And again, pace seems to be slow, even with these mandates. And I thought this was interesting in the preview, but it said that at this pace, it'll take 70 years, at least for women, to have parity with men in the boardroom. So with that, the question is, and I'll just allow you to kick it off, Caroline, because you have been wanting to talk about this. Should gender parity or meeting certain percentages really be the underlying goal? And why are the numbers themselves so often the primary focus of diversity proponents?
Yeah. I don't think anybody starts off saying that they're pro-quotas. I think it's just, ludicrous to think that you can be a pro-quota. But unfortunately, because it's psychologically, intellectually, sociologically speaking, it just doesn't make any sense. But unfortunately, history has demonstrated that it has made a difference. So again, I never thought when the law was submitted in France, so that was, it took a while to get passed, actually. It was first discussed in 2010. It got voted February 2011. There was all this uproar. This is just a French example, but it did happen across Europe. The best example, obviously, being the Nordics, Sweden and Norway, Finland behind it. So again, I think the premise is nobody's for quotas. But going back to the percentages you were referring to, and to some of the issues we talked about earlier on about speed, the specific case in France was that the numbers were going backwards. So we had, in France, at some point, the numbers had been up to 11, if not 12%. But in the last few years, those numbers were regressing. And that was the underlying foundation and the reason for the law, at least from what I know and heard about. So law was passed, and something did happen statistically, because the numbers today are closer to 22%, and they change every month, to be honest with you. So, I'm up to 21.8%. Next month, all it takes, statistically speaking, is one more nomination, and it will go over 22%. So when you look at the numbers, just the time frame between the discussion of the law and the actual passage of the law, that percentage went from 10.8% to 15%. And the law had not been passed. And between the passage of the law and today, we're again up to over 21%. So if you're just looking at the numbers, you sort of have to conclude, whoa. And you look at the pace of change and you look at the acceleration, you're like, whoa, this is just amazing. Now, the reality behind it is it's going to be the second passage, the second phase of the law, because the law says quotas up to 20% in France. Corporations have up until corporations in France have until 2014 to make that number, and they're already there. They then have up until 2017 to bring the 20% up to 40%. So that's going to be the hard part. And so if we're looking at the evidence, you look at the numbers, you're saying, this is great. It's been, it has clearly accelerated, and it's forced corporations to do something proactively about this issue. Again, going back to an earlier conversation we had, is this really the definition of diverse boards? Because at this stage, diversity is only women. So we're only dealing with 1 out of the 7 or 12 issues around diversity. And then the question is, what's going to happen next? Because I think the work that's been done today has been it's sort of the emerging tip of the iceberg. It's the quote-unquote easier part, because quite frankly, it didn't take a lot of very creative thinking to come up with these women because they existed already. And if you look at the numbers, it's all the same women who are occupying all these roles. So there's a lot of, it's been the usual suspects, and it's been women who are accumulating multiple boards and who already had sort of that board experience. So it begs the question of what's next. But, you know, again, on the quota issue, it's...
So I want to get perspective on the quota issue from others. Most of us are from the United States, so that's the perspective that we'll get. Who wants to start first with? I mean, it sounds like France saw the regression, wanted to stop it, and wanted to accelerate the pace of change. Stephen?
And part of that you asked, why do folks focus on numbers? And numbers matter because you can measure it, metrics. And as we know in business, what gets measured and rewarded gets managed. But the politics around measuring and numbers, particularly when it comes to the issue of gender, race, particularly in the United States, has a very troubled past. So the jurisprudence in this country, it's not so kind as we sit here in 2012 of thinking about these issues or legislating on it. That said, what we're talking about is leadership. And quite frankly, I think companies should be embarrassed in terms from a leadership position that there's even a notion that we have to legislate for this thing. Because you know, I think the real private ordering movement is for, whether it's chair to CEOs or lead independent directors, to simply say, this issue matters, who is on my board and board composition. We could set our own goals, and goals are, and have a reason for those goals. And again, we do a lot in the corporate governance space. Boardrooms do a lot of peer benchmarking, and we create goals around many different things, whether it's earnings per share, new store openings, same store sales, whatever it might be. And we do so because we want to be able to measure our managers in executing the goals that we put out. And you're not going to get away from that when it comes to this issue, whether we talk about diversity in our employee base and also diversity on boards. But when it comes to, again, the politics of legislative mandating quotas or even using the terms goals, again, in this country, and this is where I think you really got to look at the jurisdiction. Our history on it. It's quite interesting, right? And again, we always promote folks doing research and thinking about these issues. Where we sit in 2012, I think it would be very difficult in order to introduce such a concept. As a matter, I mean, from the jurisprudence standpoint, where the courts are, but also look at where administrative agencies and Congress is on corporate reform. I mean, the Dodd-Frank bill that's already been passed still has a long way to go to be executed, and it's going to be challenged every step of the way. So quotas is one thing. Figuring out what a swap and a swap dealer is still hasn't happened yet, although it's been in the legislation.
That's because we don't have enough women doing it.
So the lot there standing in front of sort of putting this on the legislative agenda, but does it even need to be? And I think it's an embarrassment from a leadership position that leaders need to stand up and say, this matters. This is going to be, we're going to have some objectives and goals on this. Here they are. Let's talk about why they are. And there are folks who can help them with metrics and sort of peer comparisons. And win at that metric, as they do with EPS or same-store sales, whatever it is.
Yeah, I would say that the whole piece on quotas, 2 points. One, it's lexicon that Hillary referenced earlier that is of the old world.
That's right.
We have moved into a whole new era. And when you start to talk about lexicons and quotas, that's a slow boat to being average. Because once you establish quotas, you establish a floor. Mm-hmm. What's missing are the behavioral modifications that will hopefully create a higher ceiling, a higher level of aspiration that you would want your company to reflect. And I think we could very well fall into a trap of how quotas are being looked at on the international side, as we have done so here in the States, how quotas and affirmative action and how we reference diversity in that context could very well force average behavior, not breakthrough, innovative, growth types of behavior that Hillary talked about.
You know, it's interesting, though. I think the reason why we're talking about quotas at all is because of the absence of leadership, right? So if we had leadership, we wouldn't talk about quotas. But we don't have enough leadership on these issues of diversity in the boardroom. And as a result, we get pressure for quotas. I think Steve is right to say that legally it's a complicated issue in the United States, but I think it's also fair to say that we make those changes in this country only in response to crises. And we're not out of the last one yet, so who knows what the future holds, right? I think it's safe to say with the current Congress, any such legislation, putting aside whether it would survive the Supreme Court, is unlikely. But that doesn't mean it couldn't change. I think a lot of people would have said say on pay would not happen in this country, and it did, and it's been powerful. But this year we're seeing the real power of it, right? And that is a response to a long-term concern on the part of shareholders about that particular governance issue. And if we don't see more leadership on this, we'll likely see more and powerful changes pushing on something even short of quotas in this country.
You know, my personal preference, of course, is empowered leadership.
Right.
You know, I think anytime you do quotas or legislated anything, there are unintended outcomes.
Consequences, yeah.
And it would be really silly to say that quotas don't matter. Just the fact that Norway did what they did has driven the conversation in American boardrooms about women on boards up to a much higher level than it was before, you know, the Norway, you know, action and what's going on in the rest of Europe right now. So, so even indirectly, the fact there's quotas in some places in Europe has had a positive intervention impact in the U.S.
Discussion.
So quotas are can serve a purpose. They can be a very rapid way for change. And with that speed also comes unintended outcomes.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the, that is, without trying to speak for all Americans on quotas or anything, that is always the consternation with legislated actions, especially around something as simple as a number.
That's helpful.
And
Before we leave this question, we talked about you know, a quota getting us to average, and we really want to be breakthrough and have a ceiling. We've talked about unintended consequences. I just want to get some more perspective from you, Caroline, on
And Charles can get some
and Chuck
perspective,
as well on. So talk about those. I mean, what is your experience? What are your beliefs?
You know, they're not just mine, but they did come out in the press, and they were very, they were vocalized. You know, everything that we've talked about, that the studies show, you know, that it's, so it's the usual suspects, and, you know, the question on competency and merit, and so a lot of, you know, there was clearly a backlash, and they will exist. There's no doubt about it. But a year later, again, the law was passed a year later, a number of articles have come out to sort of celebrate the one-year anniversary of the passage of the law. And, you know, the focus, I think we're beyond the focus now of a quota's good or not. The issue has been sort of parked to the side, and it's now let's get the work done and let's focus on work. So just, it's going to sound terrible, but just for that reason, there was a positive side effect and consequence of the quotas. You know, and it did work. So, you know, but again, your perspective on, from the search perspective is important.
Well, put aside the fact that I don't think we could ever get the legislation passed. The upside, if there's an upside to quotas, putting aside all the downside risks, some of the things you've experienced in, you know, in France, in terms of the, you know, perhaps a diminution of quality, creation of more, and it's much more prevalent in Europe than it is here, the the idea of the professional directors. So you have the same 200 women all serving on 6 boards.
That's exactly right.
And I have my own opinions in terms of how good or bad that is. The upside, as we talked in our earlier session, is you would, by definition, be creating opportunities for the up-and-comers, the people who should be on boards today, who have been overlooked for whatever reason, whether we're talking about the women that I discussed at the break, who are running billion-dollar businesses but don't have the CEO title yet, or other very successful senior executives who've got everything they need except perhaps the right title to be invited onto a board. They don't have the right title or they don't have the right sponsorship.
Right.
And this would be sort of legislated sponsorship, if you will. Having said that, I don't think it's viable, but I would love to find a way to create more pressure in the boardrooms, because clearly in the 18 years I've been doing this, there hasn't been enough pressure in the boardrooms to push this agenda. I'd love to find a way to create enough pressure so that these up-and-comers, these talented stars who are out there, who are continually being turned down because they're not CEOs, they're not COOs, they don't have this, they don't have that, give them a shot. Because they're, as we all know, there are a number of people sitting in boardrooms today who shouldn't be.
Well, that was the point we talked about earlier, is that should we also work in parallel where boardroom criteria, performance criteria, should be introduced around this topic as well, so that you have accountability not only from the governance side, from external legislation or mandates, but also from a behavioral side of insights and value that diversity will bring to the table. And if someone is held accountable within that boardroom beyond the CEO, and if it's some type of accountability that measures the performance of that board on this particular topic, then it allows for more debate and discussion, and to have all of these other planks as supportive to a mindset shift of the value of diversity upon corporate boards.
I think the other challenge with quotas is it just oversimplifies everything.
Absolutely.
A typical board is going to have, 9, 10, 12 members. If it's a global company, what population are you representing? You're representing the population of the country, that's your home country, your headquarters. You're representing the population of where your primary customer base is, and what population you're going to represent. And so it just oversimplifies everything if you say a number of women. Well, and then, okay, we're done with diversity. We have 40% women. Well, they're all from one country, and they don't represent your customer base. They don't do this, they don't do that. I mean, so, while it's a very tempting thing to do because it causes immediate action, as was evidenced in the comments by Caroline about France. But the reality is that it just oversimplifies things, and it removes what Ron mentioned earlier. It almost removes an obligation to be far more thoughtful and considerate for the good of the shareholders.
The French evidence is interesting because, the quota issue actually killed 2 birds or 3 birds with one stone, because what ended up happening is the nominations, the women who got on these boards, yes, they were the usual suspects, and yes, they were women, but they happened to be not all French. So it sort of, when I said kill 2 birds with one stone, they ended up being non-French, not CEOs, so they were lawyers, HR directors. So it sort of forced the whole issue, because maybe everything is relative. The whole issue of corporate governance is not as, I'm going to use a terrible term, but maybe not as advanced as it is maybe in the U.S. So because of the lag of the notion of good corporate governance, this quota issue ended up accelerating in more ways than one, not just in terms of the numbers, but in terms of introducing what are considered to be standards of good corporate governance in corporate America. Because again, this whole issue of killing 2 birds with one stone, or maybe 3 birds with one stone in certain instances.
Go ahead, Ron.
That's what I like about organizations like Stephen represents. institutional investors are forcing the issue
That's right.
within the boardrooms of what is the new criteria of performance of this body. And it's forcing those enlightened boardrooms to really think about this. So I think you have a dynamic situation of the push and the pull model, because they have to respond because of, again, you get back to the fiduciary responsibility, you get back to the metrics of performance. So it's beyond just shareholder value and and revenue and EBITDA. It is also about being a good corporate citizen, which standards are being introduced by organizations like yours.
If I could just follow up on that, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that U.S. corporate governance is more advanced than European corporate governance. I think our European colleagues would differ. They say the reverse. But what is absolutely clear is that all investors, institutional investors across the globe, are starting to ask more questions about more things, whether it's what's precipitated by the global financial crisis, and we all lost at least 40% value in our positions, or it's just a simple trajectory of enlightenment. As a shareholder, we know very little, and maybe appropriately so, about what goes on in the boardroom. We have very few windows. Executive compensation, sale and pay is actually one of them, because there's tremendous disclosure in that space. I think we'll get to talk about the new SEC disclosure around diversity and then a few other things that have come out in the last couple of years, which is more disclosure. So we look for signals, and we have a very small window of opportunity and a very small window of information, right? So your composition of the board and having discussions about who's on your board and how you do succession planning, your disclosure on why you pick board members, we live and die on that. And that's all that we have. So this is a message in terms of signaling. And what are you trying to signal to your consumers and shareholders? And I think it will eventually become very difficult for boards to hide behind the fact that no, if they have a 12-member board and they don't have any women on it, and never had, right? And there are times you have an ebb and flow and people leave or rotate off or what have you, and finding board members doesn't happen within a month. It's a long process. But when you have to answer that question over and over again, hopefully the CEO or the board chair gets tired of being asked that question. They actually do something about it. And in France and in Norway and other places, it was the legislators who pushed them to do something about it. So there's something to be said about being pushed, which, again, I think the whole panel said, from that process should be absolutely organic in terms of leadership saying that we want to succeed in this space because it actually matters.
That's helpful. So let's talk a little bit about getting away from mandates, policies around comply or explain, and whether you think that is better or not. I'd like your point of view on that versus mandates. Some countries have gone to comply and explain.
Well, so that would be sort of the Australian model more that we're talking about. And we've seen movement in Australia as a result of talk about the model, right? So, where that stops, we don't know because it's too early to tell.
Very early, yeah.
But it's at least progress. I'd say the U.S.'s disclosure policy is, like many of our disclosure policies, subject to interpretation. And so some companies have chosen to interpret diversity as in we have a marketing expert on our board, right? That is clearly not the intent of the diversity disclosure guidelines, and we need to be a little bit better. Shareholder groups and others, investors, need to be better about holding companies' feet to the fire on that because we haven't made progress in this country, right? We don't really have a comply or explain process in our country. We just have a tell us about yourself process, and those are very different. That is a less strong approach.
But
Others, Ron?
comply or explain without consequences is just that. To your point, Hillary, is then wrapping it in some type of explanation that we know will check the box that we responded to it. But if the consequences aren't there, then what's the impetus for the movement? Good intentions don't always equal the type of impact that we're looking for. And I think unless there are some type of consequences or exposure to not responding over a period of time, otherwise people, I think corporate organizations will just kind of go along and, hey, we've explained it, and great PR people and communications people will diminish, what type of risk or exposures are out there.
But isn't that where the investor community should come in and play that role? Because that is still a step beyond what we have now, which is simply describe.
Sure.
Right.
Describe, period. And there's really no explanation to that. So at least if there's the comply and explain, the explanation needs to stand on its own, or obviously there's not regulatory reprisal from that. But I would think that's the role for the investor.
Even with that discovered, it requires leadership intervention.
Yeah.
To say, that's the information that we know. That's what we've told, and being publicly, open about it. What do we do about it? Mm-hmm. How do we go beyond just the bare minimum to something that's going to be a game changer, that's going to make a difference, that's really going to drive an impact and create, as what we've all said, a competitive advantage in the sector that operate. That's where we want people to get to.
There's so much pressure on investors.
But it's good. It's good, positive pressure.
But rightfully so,
Yeah,
right? And
I was
so,
gonna say, yeah.
right, because the story, particularly in the United States, over the decades, is that most Americans participate in the equity markets and the debt capital markets through large pools of investments. Mm-hmm. Your pension fund, your 401k, mutual funds, we and other mainstream Wall Street pools of money, mutual funds, financial service companies, we own the shares, about 70% of it. And so you hope that the folks who you've given your money to care about corporate governance, not simply board composition, but many other issues, and spend the time and the effort of thinking through these things. Because also, none of this is grassroots. I mean, we have the audience of the C-suite. We're in the midst of, as we speak, my colleagues are talking to companies. We've talked to over 400 or 500 a year that we invest in, particularly now during proxy season, because they want our votes on different things. And we're one of the top 10 or top 15, top 20 investors, so we do have the ear. And certainly all investors, institutional investors, need to do more on this subject because it matters. I think let's give kudos to the SEC, which from time to time can be very much maligned, for having the courage for passing rules a couple of years ago around disclosure. And they're very broad because they allowed companies sort of define what diversity meant to them, right? So, but I think the SEC did its part. Company leaders need to do their part and really get down to the nitty-gritty of, and this is part of being able to have this conversation, right? And not being fearful of that you're going to offend one group or the another about how you define diversity, which it does mean more than, well, we have someone from the East Coast or West Coast. Which, by the way, matters. It matters.
It matters,
more East Coast people on your board probably are more inclined to pay you more because there's some research on that.
Statistics on that?
And it's really pressure on not simply board leadership, but those who serve the board and management, the chief investor relations officer, folks who were in your role and human resources, lawyers who draft these statements, to really start from scratch and really think and engage others inside the firm of what do we want to communicate to our investors, and explaining the process. Now, even if you don't have a fairly diverse board, you can have a policy, and that policy could be new about your wishes and dreams and how you're going to execute it. Right? Eventually, you need to fulfill that policy. Just like if you tell us that you think earnings per share will be X next quarter, people are going to expect that you
Hit
hit
number.
that, right? So this is no different from any of the metrics that you have in your business. But there is, so who should, I mean, I was joking about the pressures on investors, but that's where the money is. And again, we're investing on behalf, we, TI Craft and our other competitors out there, on investing on behalf of Main Street. You know, the individual investor are investing through these pools of money. They don't have a vote. We do. They don't have the seat at the table talking to corporations about how this matters. It's a different world in those conversations, right? Because folks who are in those conversations are used to talking about earnings per share and perhaps strategic issues, and are not used to talking about issues which they'll just say, well, you need to talk to someone in HR about that. That's going to become unacceptable. I mean, from the leadership position of those who are facing clients and investors need to be able to explain what the company position is. And if they can't explain it, it tells me the company doesn't have a position, right? And you're not doing your job. And the next time I talk to one of your directors, I'm going to try to be kind, but I'm sure he or she doesn't know that that's not being translated. Right? So it's I do feel it's my obligation to sort of raise that issue to the board level so that they can focus on it.
That's helpful. So we've talked about mandates as an approach and quotas. We've talked about comply or explain. We've talked about disclosure. You introduced this concept, Ron. So what is the next step here in the U.S.? What is the game changer? Opinions on that? Perspective?
More effective advocacy. How effective are you as advocates on the boards on which you serve to bring on additional women or persons of color? I mean, is it something is it an agenda you're actively pushing? If so, great. If not, why not? And do you think the 400 plus members of ELC are doing that? Because most of them are on boards.
Yeah, I think what encourages advocacy, is the disclosure, the reporting, the inspection. So no board member wants the company embarrassed, and no individual board director wants to be embarrassed. And if you have to report and disclose, and there's the risk of something as simple as embarrassment, that shouldn't be the primary motivator, but it is a motivator. And so that kind of, when you say comply or explain or disclosure, those things do contribute to an environment where people begin to own the advocacy. And you prefer that not to be the case, but it certainly helps. There are very few directors that I've met across all size companies don't really value diversity. I mean, they think it's a good thing. It's not like people walk around saying, "Oh, we don't want diversity on our board." Right. It's not like that at all. So the question is, well, if you believe it's a good thing, then what's the barriers, and why aren't you, doing more, and what is the situation on your board? And then there's 1,000 explanations, just like there are in terms of companies on diversity and leadership. They'll say, well, we have to really worry about profits right now. Like, there are two different things. Yeah. Right? I mean, the reality is what drives profits are the talent.
It's a great board.
The talent you have.
And a great
the people you have.
That's
okay?
Right.
And so if you're not paying attention to your people and how they are, who they are, and how they're organized, you will not have profits over time. So these are not separate things. And similarly with the board, you have to have that. And so it's not that visceral. People don't, in general, own it at that level. It's not that evident and clear to them. And so I think things like disclosure, explain, causes the opportunity for real discussion. I think one thing that would help is having to explain in more detail. So yes, I think if you had to articulate not just general diversity, but you had to articulate, tell me about your diversity. What about gender? What about race? What about other demographics, East Coast, West, whatever? I mean, just disclose all that. And once that happens and the board's looking at all that, things will begin to evolve on that board, because the vast majority of boards want to do the right things for the company and for the shareholders. I mean, they really viscerally believe that. And sometimes it's just a matter of putting a spotlight on something and drawing your attention to it.
I think I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think there is the emergence of a new S-curve as it relates to board members. And that is very much like Sarbanes-Oxley. Board members are going to have to accept the responsibility that this particular topic does indeed needs leadership and the art of the discussion to take place in the boardroom. And there is a degree of accountability in addition to external advocacy, but there's a degree of internal board accountability to address this business opportunity that encompass, continued growth and innovation and prosperity of those companies that operate in this space.
It does go back to, no, sorry, your turn.
Hillary.
What
Caroline.
I would love to see, right, as one of the people who's on the outside presenting terrific candidates, right, I'd like to see the CEOs of the Fortune 500 sign a pledge, stand up and say, this year I'll sponsor one diverse candidate. They don't have to put them on their own board. They can put them on someone else's board because there's room for all of them, right? I would like to see leadership at the top in this country on this issue. And I think, the Moving the Needle program is a piece of that. But as I was saying at the break, it won't work if the CEOs and directors aren't in the room. All those diverse candidates will still be talking to each other, right? So we need the leadership on all sides. And there are CEOs of Fortune 500s who've spoken on this issue and have done sponsorship and leadership. But I would love to see, and maybe we need to work harder on that kind of pressure, right, on unifying them to do it. Because if they all did it, that'd be 500 new diverse candidates in 1 year. It's not that hard. No. They're out there and they're qualified. And everybody listens if their fellow CEO says this person has the skill set for you.
No.
Don't you think there's a tendency in the boardroom? You look around the boardroom and the chairman or the CEO says, okay, well, I've got an African American, I've got a woman, I've got an Hispanic. Check, check, check. We're done.
Yes, absolutely.
We're done.
Here's the call I get from the
no,
search firms.
With no
African American
thought
women.
about. Frankly, it should be color and gender blind. Who can add the most value here? And it'd be nice to, we'd certainly like to increase the diversity on the board, but if you take a very straightforward approach and stop checking the boxes and saying, okay, well we've got our one African American, so don't tell the search firm that. Just say, just go out and find me a great athlete, whatever it is. But I think there's a tendency to, okay, well, we're done. We don't have to do any more in this area, and I think that's a real shortcoming in the system.
The day when.
Who would like to comment? Steve.
You're absolutely right. And what we have to recognize is that the issue of replicating yourself, because that's what we're talking about. And that is actually, there's a tremendous amount of research, whether it's Rosebeth, Cantor, and others who've looked at inside of corporations, why do you have this homogeneity, particularly around spaces where you're relying on someone else's judgment and trust, which is exactly what a board is. You tend to trust yourself. And so you replicate yourself, right? And so we have to recognize that as a human nature and also a chronic disease, right? And so and the way you treat sort of chronic illnesses is that you have to have a constant process or a medication or a solution that is constant. And part of that is making sure your process understands that. For instance,
that's right.
Let me go back to a sports analogy. The NFL years ago put in terms of looking for head coaches for National Football League, which, by the way, I think that job is one of the toughest jobs in the world to be a successful head football coach, that you have to present diverse candidates and at least interview one of them. I may have gotten that wrong a little bit, but you get the gist about
right.
That you have to do it, right? And of course, people say, why are you making me do this? Now we wind up that people really appreciate that process.
Right.
And you have a rather diverse coaching staff amongst the NFL teams today, which I think is part and parcel of that process of instituting into the DNA that when you go out and recruit, you need to ask these questions about how diverse your pool is to start, even before you start talking to people. Because we know it is human nature to replicate yourself and not to go outside your circles. And someone asked me last night for a simple advisory group for a community issue, and I immediately started thinking about people who I knew.
Right.
And then I stopped and said, and then the list was actually quite short, unfortunately. And I said, no, I'm going to have to ask other people to get into their circles, right? And so you have to put that into the process, right? Because then it will solve this chronic problem, which we recognize in its best case is human nature, and its worst case is something else. But you have to solve that through a process and make sure that's part of your DNA.
Sure, but that's
part of
predicated upon a business model that's within the boardroom is based on speed and consistency.
That's exactly
So
right.
by having that
You take shortcuts. So.
metric that you rely on so heavily, granted you have some enlightened CEOs and senior management team who will look for other components, but at the end of the day, when it falls back down to speed and consistency, getting people who are like me, who are aligned, so I can go out and do it. I feel that needs to be done for the good of my shareholders and my company. It might be the wrong business model that we're relying on.
There was
That's where
something.
good disclosure rules. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But that's where they come into play, right? Good disclosure rules that really go after the process actually force a process, right?
Exactly.
Forcing the information forces substance. That's the entire premise of the SEC disclosure realm, and it's no different here. So maybe we have to just re-examine a little bit what we asked for in terms of the disclosure to make sure it's producing what we need on the back end. But SEC staff do that in other areas, and they could do it here too.
But it's always the same people who are going to be asked, who are being asked those questions. So, you know, for example, what I've heard from women who've taken their first or second board mandates, who happen to be in a minority by definition, you know, why is it that they're always being asked the question on, you know, they assume that, you know, HR communication is going to be their issue. So by forcing the change of the dynamics, it's, you know, either you change the perspective of the expert, and, you know, why is the audit committee always being managed by a CFO or ex-CFO? Why is the remuneration and nomination committee always given to an HR professional? If you're forcing the change of, you know, you're basically forcing the competency issue and needing to empower people on these issues that they might not be experts on. They've been, you know, MDs or GMs or CEOs, so they should know something about HR, even if they're not HR specialists or communication specialists. By forcing the perspective, you're forcing those people to dig into issues that they're not experts on, but it's going to force them to ask the right questions, reach out to people they don't know, and it's going to, again, it's going back to your point on speed, because very often we take shortcuts on these issues where a little bit more time and reflection and forcing the issue is going to get us, hopefully, in a better position.
And sometimes having a person who actually is not that expert, isn't that actually where you want to go?
Right.
Asking the right question.
It creates the
You've got
conversation.
to have a group of people who have that intellectual curiosity, who can ask those questions, who can go beyond the optics, and the optics is what we're talking about here today. So I think that's a very interesting.
And it's been the toughest. It's really been the toughest issue for, again, just on the French example from these women who were named very often as being the first women on the board. Because everybody was looking at them because they were so different. Finding their space on the board dynamic, finding their voice in that community is really tough. So, you know, asking the right questions, we all assume is part of their job of responsibility. But in most situations, it's just been the hardest thing for these women to do.
You know, I have to hesitate to do this because I am in so violent agreement with everything you said. You know, there is that balance on disclosure. You know, sitting on a board, on several boards, I have to say that because, again, I think we have to be very considered in what we demand is disclosed.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we create significant costs, significant expenditure of time and effort for not much greater clarity for the investor.
That's a good point.
And so, having said that, I would absolutely stand by what I said in terms of more precise disclosure on diversity. But again, it has to be very considered so that it doesn't drive a bunch of unintended outcomes.
And as a person who has to read thousands of these, we want better, not more.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
And I'm a lawyer. Take it from the lawyer, who's going to give you more, and make sure that it's better. I did want to comment very quickly on the issue that really faces candidates who do join boards, and they're immediately asked because of who they are. Well, we want to put you on the right. Which one, let them have that freedom that if they are really interested in that particular, whether it's HR, that they shouldn't be denied. That's where they have that great expertise. But also to be able to push back and say, yeah, and I'll give you some help on that, and because that's my background. I'm the head of HR in my own firm, but I'm really interested in being on the audit committee. Right? I'm financially literate, and I want to be on the audit committee. And I actually had a conversation a couple of years ago with a woman who was on a board and started asking me a bunch of questions about the audit committee financial expert rule, which is a U.S. rule. Which is a comply and explain rule, that you have to have an a financial expert, and if you don't, you need to explain why, and most people don't want to explain why, so you go find. And I realized what she was doing was that she realized that she wanted to increase her opportunities for being on other boards, and one of the better ways of doing that is becoming an audit committee financial expert, because people have a tough time finding that, and people don't want to serve on an audit committee anymore. By the way, people don't want to serve on a comp committee anymore. So that there's an ebb and flow, and what we're doing today is making serving on a nom and gov committee not as a cushy job as it used to be. So the trends do flow from committee to committee about who's on the hot seat. Next is the nom and gov committee. But I thought that was a rather ingenious way, in a very genuine way, to increase her skill set, increase her marketability. And she's serving on our committee, and she's going to hit. By the way, those requirements are not easy to make when you really look at them. I mean, Maria would fit right in, by the way. Maria would fit right in for being a financial expert, given her background. But it is.
Except she can't go to any boards.
Not yet.
Right.
I'm still on the other side. I'm still the audit partner on the other side.
So she, but that is a way to make yourself unique as a candidate, and to increase your opportunity.
But how about valuing the uniqueness of being? I'm going to qualify this term, being somewhat disruptive on a board, because being in HR, you try to assess. Okay, give me a sense of the dynamics, of a particular board, and you always hear, well, very supportive. Really brings, is aligned with the management team, really understands. Rarely do you ever hear the word disruptive as being an attribute that is valued by a lot of organizations, which says to me, again, we look for this person model that has somewhat been just pounded in our heads as the ideal board member that maybe needs changing. And I'm not sure how technology is going to expose some of that as we continue to move forward in the 21st century.
Interesting.
Well, I'll tell you,
we like disruptive from a sense of a shareholder.
In a good sense.
In a good sense.
Right.
Boards are consensus-driven institutions, right? They're not like Congress. You raise your hand and vote. They're 50 nays and 49. They're consensus-driven. But again, we have very little knowledge of what goes in boardrooms unless there's a lawsuit and you get the minutes and discovery, right? But we want to know from the disclosure that we have that the folks in the room who are independent board members are doing critical thinking, challenging management appropriately, and being respected. And we know how hard that is, because if you challenge too hard, your other board members see that, and when it's time for a referral to get on another board, you're
That's
the
my
one
point.
that they refer.
That's the point I was building off of.
That's right.
Well, I think the self-assessment process on most boards, I don't think the word disruptive is used around, but I would say critical thinking, appropriate challenging, and those words are used, and it is a serious part of the assessment on most boards. So I think once you're in, again, these core values are there, but It's the process to get the right diversity of thinking there in the first place. But they are definitely self-assessing to say, are we just going along with everything? Are we really asking the right questions? Are we reviewing the strategies? Are we challenging appropriately management? And the challenge appropriately is maybe the euphemism for disruptive.
Right,
But,
right.
Yeah, and
That takes us full circle to this, people like themselves, right? That's what the
Yeah,
studies show. And we think that people like us will be less disruptive, to use this sort of negative
sure.
version of disruptive. And yet, clearly, board members, it is their job to ask questions and question
that's
answers.
the whole
No,
point.
I don't think any of us could debate that. As a governance matter, that's
Right.
like flat out what they're supposed to be
Absolutely.
doing in the boardroom, and it's all in how you do it.
How you interpret it.
Right? And the fact is, people who are diverse in the traditional sense that we're discussing today can do that in the same way that their other counterparts can.
Exactly.
I don't think the reason why I like all of you is because you're like me on this point. I don't think that we have to debate that in here, but
Right.
the question is, again, how do we carry that forward?
So with that, Deborah, unless you have any other questions that you think that we should touch on.
I was just going to simply ask Chuck if he could speak to his experience with the mindset of the boards that you've worked with, because I think that's very interesting about the notion that somebody different may be disruptive, and whether that in fact is one of those deep-seated obstacles that we have to overcome when we open ourselves up to bringing somebody on the board who's not like us.
Well, I'll tell you, my experiences with hundreds and hundreds of companies over the years, I can tell you one thing. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of rule. They're very different. Some boards really want directors who will challenge the status quo. What I've always said is that the really smart, most successful CEOs have got the toughest boards and the best boards, and the board raises the bar for everybody. So a CEO should never be afraid of having a director. And a good CEO will never be afraid of having a director who's going to ask the tough questions. Having said that, I've placed directors who ask a lot of tough questions. I've had situations, in fact, one very recently, where I did the referencing on, well, let's limit it right now to 2 finalists. And the references all came back pretty much the same. They were all glowing, all positive. Both had been, had very successful careers in their respective industries. Both were sort of fun to be around people. But one was a little more prickly in the boardroom. One asked some pointed questions in the right way, but and was never offended. But this was the fellow who, boy, I'll tell you, if there was one one thing wrong, he had a tendency to find it and bring it up and ask the tough question. He didn't get the position. Surprise, surprise. So, I mean, to the point that's been made several times now, we tend to want to recruit somebody who's like us, who's going to think like us. That flies in the face of the whole concept of diversity.
Right.
Because we have a very, very diverse group here. And yet every single one of us, regardless of color or gender, has had very, very different set of life experiences. So the fact that we have 3 African American men, oh, well, you're all the same, you all bring the same thing to the table. It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. So I think that there are a lot of really good companies out there, really good boards who are trying to do the right thing, and it's tough. For some of them, it's tough to do, but I think most of them, legislation aside, Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, all of this aside, I think most companies are trying to do the right thing. But there's an education process that's going to be ongoing, and diversity is going to continue to be a challenge because we have to get people to think about what diversity really is. And it's not about color, and it's not about gender. Those are factors. but there's so much more to it. And the goal of any board should be to have 8 or 10 or 12 people in there who bring totally different sets of business and life experiences to the table, who can all contribute in a unique way.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Well said.
Well said.
Very well said.
Maria, can I ask one other favor, just from a
Sure.
production point of view? I'm wondering if we could, each of you could just take a minute and sort of summarize the keys to diversity making headway in the next couple of years, okay? And try not to refer to each other's comments. Just, even if you repeat what their points were, that's fine. I just think for production purposes, that having that from each of you would be fine. And then Deborah and Maria, if you could think at the end of just summarizing the session. Again, we may use it, we may not, but just so that we have
Sure.
that on film, I think that that's going to be helpful for the dinner. So, Ron, maybe we can start with you, go around, and then do Maria and Deborah. Just a minute hitting on the points that are very important.
Okay. I think when you really look at this particular issue that we're dealing with, Maria, and appreciate the New York Stock Exchange of hosting this, it's about really growth. It's about sustained growth. It's about innovation. It's about how do you master and have a broad access to new ideas, new approaches, new processes, new goods and services that you can introduce to those who use them. And at the end of the day, in order to achieve that growth and innovation, I think you have to look at the whole dynamic of diversity, both from a race and gender standpoint, as well as all the other dimensions that make up diversity as we know it within a global context. If those companies can embrace that and institutionalize it as a part of their unique culture, those will be the successful companies that we'll be talking about as advancing this topic in the 21st century.
I think that good business strategy always involves innovation and growth. And to get there, we know that diversity makes a difference. Having different viewpoints and different thoughts and different conversations leads to better outcomes. And I think to move the ball forward, we have to both use that as our background and then focus on leadership and sponsorship. We need some specific strategies to move us forward. And to get there, we need people to take leadership, and we need those people to be sponsors and give a hand up to all the other people who are sitting out there well qualified and in the zone, but who just haven't quite gotten there yet.
You know, I think any company wants the best thinking possible to steward the shareholders' asset and to try to accelerate shareholder value. Everybody wants that. Diversity is a component that enhances the probability of having the best thinking possible. And boards really need to do a self-evaluation, look at their makeup across all aspects of diversity, and realize that if they really proactively engineer over time real diversity on that board, they are giving their shareholders the best opportunity for the best possible thinking and freedom to operate. And the practical things to do there is to absolutely have sponsorship. CEOs should be identify a person to sponsor for their board or another board. Individuals that are preparing should absolutely make certain they get some of those critical skills, whether it's exposure to presenting to analysts, if it's a publicly traded board they're interested in, or whatever the other experience is. They need to own that, to say, I'm not going to let these screens keep me out. And then both the nominating chairs, the lead directors of the boards, and the CEOs, have to broaden their screens. To have arbitrary screens that say, well, I only want them if they're a sitting CEO. I only want them if they're a retired partner from a Big Four accounting firm. You have to move beyond these arbitrary screens to look at, why did you want that person? What skills and competencies do you think that sitting CEO was going to bring? What skills and competencies do you think that retired partner from a Big Four accounting firm was going to bring. Identify people that exhibit those skills, whether they have the title or not.
The best CEOs value a really great board, and they use a really great board to make them better and to make their companies better. And this ultimately leads to better shareholder returns. How do you make a board better? Clearly, diversity is one element. Diversity of race, of gender, of thought, of functional experiences and background. It truly is a portfolio approach to building or replenishing a board. So the really good CEOs appreciate that. They understand how to use a board. They understand the value of diversity in all of its different definitions within a boardroom. And as we move forward, diversity, as we all understand, is a process. It's not an event. It's not something that happens quickly. Clearly, we've seen that. But it should certainly be the goal.
I don't think there's a way to go back. I mean, diversity does exist and is recognized, and I think nobody would disagree with that. And when we talk about good corporate governance, I think diversity is ingrained in that thought. So from where we're sitting, there's no way to go back. The questions that we've discussed and talked about is how do we go forward? We all have different perspective and cultural, from a maturity standpoint in terms of where good corporate governance stands. We've talked about different carrots, we've talked about different sticks. But again, you know, if we recognize that there's no going back, and in and of itself, it's a recognition that there's only one way to go, and that is forward.
As a large institutional shareholder, what we want is what our clients want. We want long-term, sustainable shareholder value, year over year. And as we examine that as a large institutional shareholder and examine board composition and examine board performance and company performance, diversity in who's on the board matters. And it's one of the questions that we ask, along with strategy, along with what you're doing or not doing with your poison pill or the threat of a poison pill or other corporate governance issues. Who's on your board and why you have folks on your board matters deeply to us, not simply from a moral issue. At the end of the day, the 4.2 million people who are investing our money with TIA Craft want to be able to get to retirement and live through retirement. So we're looking for success. And the way that we think about diversity and board composition is that it matters of who's in the boardroom. We have a very small window inside of what actually happens in boards. And most folks really don't know what goes on in boards until something goes wrong and there's disclosure through lawsuits or New York Times or Wall Street Journal articles and different exposés. So I think with that in mind, it is really incumbent upon corporations and boardrooms to have much better discussions about how they go through that process and how they think about diversity. And I'll leave you with this last point of, I think where we are, at least in the United States, is that we have to get, even today in 2012, we have to get more comfortable in having that conversation. Because we can all agree that diversity matters, but then we look at the numbers and we're measuring on that point and we fall short. So we have to figure out how to get over these barriers, and that's what we've talked about today in terms of different things that we can do to get over those barriers. And at the end of the day, leadership has to commit itself to winning on this point.
Helpful. So I would like to thank each one of you for joining us this morning. And it's been my pleasure to serve as your moderator. And I thank you for being very candid, for talking about the topic with candor, for having the courage to say things like it takes leadership to change. We need to be introspective and change our own behaviors. and that there are ways that we can move the needle, and that there are some game changers out there. So I thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Again, I'll reiterate with Maria, thank you so much. This was every bit as engaging and enlightening as we had hoped it would be. I think one of the most interesting things in listening to the full course of this conversation is the paradox that diversity really opens up. Because on one hand, we're trying to grapple with the numbers, and the numbers do mean something, but what do they really mean? Shareholders are looking for value. Boards have a fiduciary responsibility to do everything possible to create that value. So what we really need are effective boards. And our Moving the Needle program, if you'll read the subhead, the really important part to that is building effective boards with qualified, diverse candidates. That diversity can be diversity that we can see, but more importantly, I think it's the diversity of the ideas and the perspective that board brings to bear. So it's an interesting paradox, and it's one that won't be solved anytime soon, and it's a lot of things that have to be running at the same time to reach this goal that we all agree is worthwhile. But it's been very interesting, and I appreciate everyone's time in sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.